Odysseus won the greatest war the ancient world had ever known. Then he spent 10 years trying to reach a home that should have been only a few weeks away. This is not simply a story about monsters, shipwrecks, angry gods, or enchanted islands. It is the story of a man struggling to remember who he is, while the world repeatedly offers him the chance to forget. It is the story of a warrior who survives victory, only to discover that returning to ordinary life may be more difficult than conquering a city. Above all, it is a story about nostos, the ancient Greek idea of homecoming, the long, painful return, not only to a place, but to a family, an identity, and a life that time has nearly erased. When the city of Troy finally fell after 10 years of war, the Greek kings prepared to sail home. Odysseus, ruler of the small island kingdom of Ithaca, had already been absent from his wife, Penelope, and his infant son, Telemachus, for a decade. He had earned fame through intelligence rather than brute strength. It was Odysseus who conceived the wooden horse, the deception that brought Greek soldiers through the gates of Troy. Yet the same cleverness that made him famous would also become a source of pride, and pride, in the world of Greek myth, could attract the attention of gods. His voyage home would lead him across the Mediterranean, transformed into a landscape of memory, temptation, terror, and loss. He would encounter people who had forgotten the meaning of home, creatures who lived beyond the boundaries of human law, and immortals who offered him escape from age, grief, and death. He would lose every ship under his command and every companion who had followed him from Troy. He would descend into the land of the dead, hear voices from his past, resist songs that promised forbidden knowledge, and spend years trapped on an island where time itself seemed to stand still. Yet while Odysseus wandered, Ithaca was also falling into disorder. In his palace, powerful men consumed his wealth and demanded that Penelope choose a new husband. They violated xenia, the sacred Greek law of hospitality, by entering another man's home as guests and behaving like conquerors. Penelope resisted them through patience and cunning. Telemachus grew from an uncertain child into a young man searching for news of a father he could barely remember. The household waited between hope and mourning, unsure whether Odysseus was alive, dead, or already becoming nothing more than a story. The Odyssey asks a quiet but unsettling question. After war has ended and glory has been won, can a person truly return to the life they left behind? Odysseus will discover that reaching Ithaca is not enough. He must learn restraint after years of violence. He must hide his name after building his reputation upon it. He must enter his own home as a stranger and determine who has remained loyal during his absence. Before he can reclaim his throne, he must prove that he still belongs beside the woman who has waited for him. Tonight, we will follow that entire journey, from the smoking ruins of Troy to the final recognition beside a bed built around a living olive tree. We will sail through storms and darkness, listen to the voices of gods and ghosts, and watch one exhausted man reject immortality for the fragile comforts of human life. This is the voyage of Odysseus, but beneath its ancient names and distant seas lies a longing that has never grown old, the desire to return to the place where someone still remembers us. Before Odysseus became the weary traveler of legend, before he faced giants, witches, storms, and the dead, he stood among the ruins of Troy as one of the most celebrated men in the Greek world. The war had lasted 10 years. For 10 long seasons, the armies of the Greek kingdoms had camped beside the walls of Troy, fighting for a city that seemed impossible to conquer. Men had crossed the sea from Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Salamis, Ithaca, and many other lands. They came under the command of kings whose names would outlive their bodies. Agamemnon, the powerful ruler of Mycenae; Menelaus, whose wife Helen had been taken to Troy; Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks; Ajax, strong and silent; Nestor, old and wise; and Odysseus, king of rocky Ithaca, whose greatest weapon was not a sword, but a mind that never stopped searching for another path. Odysseus had not wanted to go to war. When the Greek leaders first came to summon him, he had recently married Penelope, and their son, Telemachus, was still an infant. Odysseus knew that the war would be long. According to later traditions, he tried to avoid the expedition by pretending to be insane. He yoked a horse and an ox together and began plowing a field with salt. But the man sent to test him placed the infant Telemachus in the path of the plow. Odysseus immediately turned aside to protect his son, revealing that his madness was only an act. And so he sailed to Troy. He left behind a young wife, a newborn child, an aging father, and a kingdom that depended on his return. At the time, he could not have known that 20 years would pass before he saw them again. The wooden horse finally ended the war. The Greeks built the enormous structure, hid chosen warriors inside it, and pretended to sail away. The Trojans, believing the horse to be an offering, dragged it through their gates. During the night, Odysseus and the others emerged from its hollow body. They opened the city gates, and the Greek army returned from the darkness. Troy was burned. The proud towers fell. Houses became ruins. Temples were violated. Families were torn apart. The victory that the Greeks had desired for 10 years arrived covered in smoke and blood. For Odysseus, the fall of Troy brought glory. His plan had succeeded. His intelligence had achieved what thousands of soldiers could not. The city had been conquered not through greater strength, but through deception, patience, and imagination. Yet the victory also carried a warning. In the ancient Greek imagination, human beings were expected to understand their limits. Success could be dangerous because it encouraged pride. A victorious man might begin to believe that he had triumphed without the gods. He might forget that fortune could change as suddenly as the wind. The Greeks had won the war, but they had not all behaved honorably in victory. Sacred places had been attacked. Supplicants had been killed. The defeated had been treated with cruelty. The journey home would not be peaceful for many of the returning kings. Agamemnon would reach his palace, only to be murdered. Menelaus would wander for years before returning to Sparta. Ajax would never see his homeland again. And Odysseus, who expected to sail from Troy to Ithaca in a matter of weeks, would instead spend 10 more years moving from one disaster to another. When his 12 ships left the coast of Troy, the men aboard them were not yet the broken survivors they would become. They were soldiers returning from victory. Their ships carried weapons, armor, treasure, and the memories of war. Perhaps they imagined the welcome awaiting them. Perhaps they saw in their minds the familiar hills of home, the fires burning on household altars, the faces of children who had grown older in their absence. Perhaps some wondered whether they would be recognized. 10 years is a long time. A child becomes an adult. A father becomes an old man. A wife learns to live with uncertainty. For Odysseus, the distance between Troy and Ithaca was more than a journey across water. It was a journey from war back into human life. A warrior learns one kind of order. He wakes among armed men. He obeys signals. He survives through suspicion. He measures time by battles, marches, wounds, and funerals. Home demands something different. At home, a man must become a husband again, a father, a son, a king who listens rather than commands. He must sleep without a weapon beside him. He must learn that silence does not always conceal danger. The Odyssey begins in the shadow of this problem. How does a man return from war? Not simply how does he cross the sea, but how does he cross the invisible distance between the person he became and the person he once was? At first, the voyage seemed to begin like another military campaign. The ships sailed north from Troy and reached the land of the Cicones at a city called Ismarus. The Cicones had supported the Trojans during the war, and Odysseus and his men treated them as enemies. They attacked the city, killed the men who resisted, and seized wealth, livestock, food, and wine. This episode is easy to pass over because it happened so early. There is no monster here, no sorceress, no divine thunderbolt. only a raid carried out by men who have not yet understood that the war is over. Odysseus had left Troy, but Troy had not yet left Odysseus. His companions behaved as soldiers in enemy territory. They took what they wanted because conquest had become familiar. The boundaries between victory and violence had blurred. After 10 years of war, plunder seemed almost natural. Odysseus urged his men to return to the ships quickly. He understood that remaining on the shore was dangerous, but the men refused. They slaughtered animals, opened jars of wine, and celebrated. They had survived Troy. They believed the worst was behind them. Their confidence was fatal. The Cicones who escaped the first attack called for help from their neighbors, inland. These reinforcements were stronger and more numerous. At dawn, they came against the Greeks in organized ranks. The battle continued through the day. Odysseus and his men fought beside their ships, trying to hold the shore. For a time, they resisted. But as the sun moved lower, the Cicones gained the advantage. 6 men from every ship were killed. 72 companions died before the voyage had truly begun. The survivors pushed their ships into the sea and escaped, grieving for the men they had lost. This first disaster establishes one of the great patterns of the Odyssey. Odysseus may be clever, but his intelligence cannot always control the desires of others. He can warn his men, but he cannot force them to listen. Again and again, hunger, curiosity, greed, exhaustion, and pride will weaken the discipline of the crew. The raid on Ismarus also reveals how difficult it is to leave violence behind. The men are technically going home, yet they continue to act as though every foreign shore is part of the battlefield. Their true journey will require more than navigation. They must rediscover the laws that allow human beings to live together. Among the most important of these laws was xenia, the sacred custom of hospitality. In the ancient Greek world, travel was dangerous. There were no modern hotels, no reliable police forces, and no easy way to know whether a stranger came in peace. Hospitality created a fragile bridge between unfamiliar people. A host was expected to welcome a traveler, offer food, provide shelter, and only later ask the visitor's name and purpose. The guest, in return, was expected to behave respectfully, accept what was given, and avoid abusing the household. Zeus himself was believed to protect strangers and guests. Throughout the Odyssey, xenia becomes a test of civilization. Good people honor it, dangerous people violate it. The difference between a civilized home and a place of chaos is often revealed by the way a stranger is received. At Ismarus, however, Odysseus and his men are not guests. They arrive as raiders. They take rather than receive. They enter another people's land under the rules of war. The consequences are immediate. After escaping the Cicones, Odysseus ordered funeral cries for the dead. The surviving men called each lost companion by name 3 times before sailing onward. This ritual mattered. The dead could not simply disappear into the sea of memory. Their names had to be spoken. Their absence had to be acknowledged. Already the voyage home was becoming a journey haunted by voices. The ships continued southward, but then the weather changed. Zeus sent a violent storm. The sky darkened. The sea rose beneath the ships. Winds tore at the sails, and the men struggled to keep the vessels from breaking apart. They lowered the masts and rowed toward land. For 2 days and 2 nights, they remained trapped on the shore, exhausted by grief and labor. On the 3rd day, they raised the masts again and continued. Odysseus believed they might still reach Ithaca. The route home remained possible. Then, as they approached the southern point of Greece, another wind seized them. For 9 days, the ships were driven across the sea. This is the moment when the known world begins to loosen its hold. Until now, the voyage has remained connected to real places and recognizable forms of warfare. Troy, Ismarus, the Greek coast. But after the storm carries the fleet away, the journey enters a more dreamlike geography. The islands ahead are not merely locations on a map. They are states of mind. Each one tests some part of the human desire to return. On the 10th day, the men reached the land of the Lotus Eaters. The shore appeared peaceful. There were no walls, no armies, no sounds of battle. Odysseus selected a small group of men and sent them inland to discover who lived there. The people they met did not attack them. Instead, they offered them lotus. The exact plant described by Homer is uncertain. It may not correspond to any single flower known today. In the poem, its importance is not botanical, it is symbolic. Those who ate the lotus lost the desire to return home. They did not fall dead. They did not become violent. They did not suffer visible pain. They simply wanted to remain where they were, eating the sweet plant and allowing everything else to fade. Their families became distant. Their duties became unimportant. Their memories of Ithaca, of familiar voices, of promises made before the war, softened until they no longer pulled at the heart. This was one of the quietest dangers Odysseus would ever face. A monster can be recognized as an enemy. A storm announces itself with thunder. A sword leaves blood. But forgetting can feel gentle. The lotus offered relief. The men had spent 10 years at war. They had watched friends die. They had survived the fall of Troy, the battle with the Cicones, and storms that nearly destroyed their ships. Their desire to stop was understandable. The lotus did not promise victory or glory. It promised freedom from longing. To forget home is also to forget the pain of being separated from it. Odysseus refused that peace. When he discovered what had happened, he dragged the affected men back to the ships. They wept and resisted. He tied them beneath the rowing benches so they could not escape, then ordered the rest of the crew to leave immediately. His actions were harsh, but they reveal something essential about nostos. The desire to return home must sometimes be protected from exhaustion. There are moments when memory feels heavier than forgetfulness, moments when the easiest path is to stop caring about what has been lost. Odysseus understands that if his men remain among the Lotus Eaters, they may live, but they will no longer be the people who left Troy. They will have surrendered their names, their histories, and the bonds that connect them to others. The first great temptation of the Odyssey is not power. It is not wealth. It is not even immortality. It is the temptation to forget. Odysseus orders the ships back into open water. Behind them lies the quiet land of the Lotus, where no one needs to grieve because no one remembers what grief is attached to. Ahead lies danger, suffering, and uncertainty. Yet ahead also lies the possibility of home. The men lift their oars. The sea receives them once again. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, Penelope waits in Ithaca, Telemachus grows older, and the palace of Odysseus begins to fill with men who believe he will never return. After leaving the land of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his men sailed into waters that seemed to carry them farther from the ordinary world. The coastline ahead was rugged and unfamiliar. Near it lay a small, fertile island, rich with wild goats, and untouched by human cultivation. The Greeks landed there, hunted, ate, and rested. Across a narrow channel, they could see smoke rising from another shore. Odysseus became curious. Curiosity is one of his greatest strengths. It allows him to notice what other men miss, to imagine hidden possibilities, and to find a path through danger. Yet curiosity is also one of his most dangerous weaknesses. Odysseus does not merely want to survive the world. He wants to know it. He wants to see who lives beyond the next ridge, what customs they follow, what treasures they possess, and what stories he might one day tell about them. The next morning, he chose one ship and a small group of companions. The rest of the fleet remained behind on the island. Odysseus crossed the channel toward the land of the Cyclopes. In Homer's poem, the Cyclopes are not presented as members of an organized kingdom. They have no assemblies, no shared laws, and no public institutions. Each one lives alone with his family in a cave, ruling his household according to his own will. They do not farm the earth or build ships. They trust that the land will provide what they need. To a modern listener, this might sound peaceful. To an ancient Greek audience, however, The absence of agriculture, law, councils, and hospitality marked a life outside civilization. The Cyclops lived without the bonds that connected one household to another. They had homes, but not a society. Odysseus left most of his crew beside the ship and selected 12 men to travel inland with him. He carried a skin of exceptionally strong wine, given to him by a priest named Marin after the raid on Ismarus. Odysseus had spared Marin and his family, and in gratitude, the priest had offered him gifts. Even after one act of violence, a small act of mercy had produced something valuable. The wine would soon become a weapon more powerful than a sword. Odysseus and his companions found a large cave near the sea. Inside were baskets filled with cheese, pens held lambs and young goats, containers overflowed with milk and whey. The place belonged to a shepherd of great wealth. Odysseus's men urged him to act quickly. They wanted to take the cheese, gather some of the animals, return to the ship, and sail away before the owner came home. It was sensible advice. Odysseus refused. He wanted to meet the inhabitant of the cave. More importantly, he hoped to receive a guest gift. Under the custom of xenia, a stranger could expect hospitality from a proper host. Odysseus assumed that the rules of the human world would apply here. But the land of the Cyclopes existed beyond those rules. The men lit a fire, ate some cheese, and waited. As evening approached, the owner returned. His name was Polyphemus. He was a Cyclops, a giant with enormous strength and a single eye in the center of his forehead. He carried a load of dry wood that crashed against the cave floor when he dropped it. Behind him came his sheep and goats. Then he rolled a massive stone across the entrance. The stone was so heavy that even many strong men could not have moved it together. Odysseus and his companions were trapped. Polyphemus began his evening work. He milked the animals, separated the young from their mothers, and prepared the cheese. Only after completing these ordinary tasks did he notice the strangers crouching in the cave. His voice filled the darkness. He asked who they were and where they had come from. Odysseus answered carefully. He said that they were Greek soldiers returning from Troy. He reminded the Cyclops that strangers and suppliants were under the protection of Zeus. He asked for the hospitality that sacred custom required. Polyphemus laughed at the warning. He said that the Cyclopes did not care about Zeus or the other gods. They were stronger than the gods, he claimed, and had no need to fear them. This rejection of xenia tells the audience exactly what kind of being Polyphemus is. He does not simply fail to welcome guests. He rejects the entire moral structure that makes strangers safe among one another. Then he asked Odysseus where his ship was. Odysseus sensed danger and lied. He said that Poseidon had destroyed the vessel on the rocks, and that the surviving men had reached the cave alone. This lie protected the sailors who had remained on the shore. If Polyphemus knew where the ship was hidden, he might destroy it or kill those waiting beside it. The Cyclops gave no reply. Instead, he seized 2 of the men. He struck them against the ground, tore them apart, and ate them. The horror of the scene lies not only in violence, but in the reversal of hospitality. A good host gives food to a guest. Polyphemus makes the guests into food. He drinks their blood, consumes their flesh, and leaves nothing behind. The cave, which first seemed full of abundance, becomes a prison. Odysseus reaches for his sword. He considers killing the Cyclops as he sleeps, but his mind moves beyond the immediate desire for revenge. If Polyphemus dies, no one will be able to move the stone blocking the entrance. Odysseus and his companions will remain trapped until they starve. Here, intelligence means restraint. Odysseus must endure the presence of the monster who has murdered his men. He must wait beside him through the night. He must control anger long enough to create a plan. At dawn, Polyphemus wakes, milks his animals, and eats 2 more Greeks. Then he rolls the stone aside, drives his flock outside, and seals the cave again. Odysseus studies everything around him. He notices a large wooden club, a section of olive tree that Polyphemus has cut and left to dry. It is as long and heavy as the mast of a ship. Odysseus orders his men to cut a section from it. They shape one end into a sharp point. He hardens the point in the fire, then hides the weapon beneath piles of dung. The men draw lots to determine who will help him. 4 are chosen. That evening, Polyphemus returns and seals the cave. Again, he completes his work. Again, he seizes 2 men and eats them. Odysseus approaches him with the strong wine. He tells the Cyclops that such a meal should be followed by a drink. Polyphemus tastes the wine. He has never experienced anything like it. The drink is powerful, sweet, and far stronger than the crude wine of his own land. He asks for more. Odysseus gives him another cup, and then another. The Cyclops becomes drunk. In a sudden imitation of hospitality, Polyphemus asks Odysseus his name. He promises to give him a guest gift. Odysseus answers with one of the most famous lies in Western literature. My name is nobody. In Greek, the wordplay is more precise than it can be in English. Odysseus chooses a name that can also mean no one. The trick depends not on strength, but on language. Polyphemus accepts the answer. Then he announces his gift. He will eat nobody last. This is the Cyclops' idea of generosity. Soon, overcome by wine, Polyphemus falls backward and sleeps. Odysseus and the chosen men bring out the wooden stake. They place its sharpened point in the fire until it glows. Then they lift it together and drive it into the Cyclops' eye. Polyphemus wakes with a roar. He pulls the burning wood from his face. Blood pours down around the empty socket. His cries echo across the hills. The other Cyclopes hear him and gather outside the sealed cave. They ask who is hurting him. Polyphemus shouts that nobody is killing him. The other Cyclopes are confused. If nobody is attacking him, they reply, then his suffering must come from the gods. They advise him to pray to Poseidon and leave. The trick succeeds because Polyphemus has no community strong enough to investigate further. The Cyclopes live separately. They do not share responsibility for one another. The same isolation that seemed like freedom now leaves Polyphemus alone in his pain. But Odysseus and his men are still trapped. The stone remains across the entrance. Polyphemus cannot see, but he is not helpless. At dawn, he sits near the doorway and moves the stone aside. He places his hands over the backs of his animals as they pass, searching for the Greeks. Odysseus has already prepared another plan. The rams are large and covered in thick wool. Odysseus ties 3 animals together. Beneath the middle one, he secures a man. The sheep on either side conceal the human body. Odysseus chooses the largest ram for himself and clings beneath its belly. One by one, the animals move toward the entrance. Polyphemus feels their backs, but does not search underneath them. As the largest ram passes, the Cyclops stops it. He speaks to the animal with unexpected tenderness. He wonders why it is the last to leave the cave when it usually walks first. Perhaps, he says, the ram grieves for its master's wounded eye. If only it could speak and tell him where nobody is hiding. For a moment, the monster is given a voice of loneliness. The scene does not excuse him. Polyphemus remains a murderer and a violator of sacred law, yet Homer allows even the monster a moment of sorrow. The Cyclops has lost his sight, and the only creature to whom he can speak with affection cannot answer him. The ram carries Odysseus safely into the morning. Once all the survivors are outside, they release themselves and drive the flock toward the ship. The sailors waiting on the shore rejoice when they see Odysseus return. Then they notice how few men are with him, and their relief turns to mourning. They load the sheep and push the vessel into the water. At last, they are free. This should be the end of the encounter. Odysseus has escaped through patience, deception, courage, and cooperation. He has defeated an enemy far stronger than himself. The name Nobody has protected him. Silence has saved him. But Odysseus is not satisfied. As the ship moves away from shore, he calls back to Polyphemus. He mocks the Cyclops. Polyphemus hears the voice and tears a massive rock from the hillside. He throws it toward the sound. The stone strikes the sea near the ship, and the wave nearly drives the vessel back to land. The crew begs Odysseus to stop. They know the danger is not over. Odysseus ignores them. When the ship has moved farther away, he calls out again. This time, he reveals the truth. He tells Polyphemus that if anyone asks who blinded him, he should say it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. In that moment, Odysseus chooses fame over safety. The ancient Greek heroic world placed enormous value on reputation. A great deed mattered, partly because it could be attached to a name. To perform something extraordinary and remain unknown was almost a kind of loss. Odysseus cannot bear to let nobody receive the glory. He wants the story to survive. He wants Polyphemus to know who defeated him. But a name can be both an identity and a target. Polyphemus raises his hands and prays to his father. His father is Poseidon, god of the sea. The Cyclops asks that Odysseus never reach home. If fate has decided that he must return, then let him arrive late, alone, in misery, having lost all his companions. Let him find trouble waiting inside his own house. The prayer shapes the rest of the journey. Poseidon hears his son. The sea through which Odysseus must travel now belongs to an enemy. Polyphemus throws another rock. This one lands behind the ship and drives it toward the island where the rest of the fleet waits. Odysseus and his surviving men return to their companions. They divide the stolen animals and offer the largest ram as a sacrifice to Zeus. But Zeus does not accept the offering. The men eat, mourn the dead, and sleep beside the shore. At dawn, they sail onward. The episode of the Cyclops is often remembered as an adventure in which a clever man defeats a powerful monster. Yet beneath the excitement lies a warning about the limits of intelligence. Odysseus escapes because he can hide his identity. He suffers because he cannot remain hidden. His mind saves him, but his pride endangers him. He understands the value of patience inside the cave, yet forgets it once he reaches the safety of the sea. He resists the urge to kill Polyphemus when killing would trap him, but he cannot resist the urge to claim credit when silence would protect him. The name Odysseus carries glory. It also carries responsibility. From this point forward, the sea knows who he is. And far away in Ithaca, his own name is slowly becoming uncertain. Some believe he is dead. Others begin to speak of him as a memory. His son grows up beneath the shadow of a father whose reputation is larger than his presence. Odysseus has announced himself to the monster. Now, he must spend years trying to return to the people who may no longer recognize him. The ships leave the island of the Cyclops behind. Ahead lies a keeper of winds, a disastrous act of suspicion, and a fleet moving closer to destruction with every mile. After escaping from the island of the Cyclopes, Odysseus and his surviving companions sailed onward beneath a sky that seemed calm. But calm seas no longer meant safety. Behind them, Polyphemus had raised his hands and called upon Poseidon. The prayer of the wounded Cyclops now followed the fleet like an invisible storm. Odysseus could not see it. His men could not hear it. Yet from that moment forward, every favorable wind carried the possibility of sudden reversal. The next island they reached belonged to Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus lived in a bronze-walled palace upon a floating island. His home was orderly, prosperous, and filled with music. He lived there with his sons and daughters, surrounded by feasts and comfort. Unlike the Cyclops, Aeolus understood hospitality. He welcomed Odysseus, offered food and shelter, and listened to the story of Troy. For 1 month, Odysseus remained as his guest. He told Aeolus about the long war, the fall of the city, and the Greek fleet's departure. Perhaps during those peaceful weeks, Odysseus allowed himself to believe that the worst of the voyage had passed. Aeolus did more than feed him. When the time came for the Greeks to leave, the keeper of the winds gave Odysseus an extraordinary gift. He gathered every dangerous wind and sealed them inside a leather bag made from the hide of an ox. Only the gentle western wind remained free, blowing steadily toward Ithaca. Aeolus tied the bag with a silver cord and placed it aboard Odysseus's ship. The gift was both simple and miraculous. All Odysseus had to do was keep the bag closed. For 9 days and 9 nights, the ships sailed toward home. Odysseus remained awake, holding the rudder and guarding the mysterious bag. He trusted no one else with it. On the 10th day, the hills of Ithaca appeared. The men were close enough to see fires burning along the shore. Odysseus had crossed the sea. He had survived battle, storm, forgetfulness, and the cave of the Cyclops. After 20 years away, his homeland was finally within sight. Then exhaustion overcame him. Odysseus fell asleep. His companions looked at the leather bag beside him. For days, they had watched their king guard it. He had not told them exactly what it contained. To Odysseus, secrecy may have seemed wise. His men had already shown themselves to be impulsive, yet secrecy creates its own danger. They began to whisper. Aeolus had honored Odysseus with gifts, while they had received nothing. Their king already possessed treasure from Troy. Perhaps the bag contained gold and silver. Perhaps Odysseus intended to return home richer than all of them, while they arrived with empty hands. Their suspicion hardened into resentment. They untied the silver cord. At once, the imprisoned winds burst free. The sea rose. The sails snapped. The ships were seized by a violent storm and driven backward across the water. Odysseus woke to chaos. For a moment, he considered throwing himself into the sea. Ithaca had been close enough to see, and now it was disappearing beyond the horizon. The loss was more painful because home had not been an idea. It had been visible. Odysseus chose to live. He wrapped himself in his cloak and endured as the storm carried the fleet back to the island of Aeolus. When the Greeks returned, Odysseus approached the palace and begged for help again, but Aeolus refused. He could not understand how a man favored by the winds had returned in such misery. To Aeolus, the explanation was clear. Odysseus must be hated by the gods. Helping him again might invite divine anger upon the entire household. The keeper of the winds ordered him to leave. This rejection is one of the coldest moments in the journey. Aeolus had welcomed Odysseus as a guest, but hospitality in the ancient world did not always mean endless loyalty. Misfortune could be interpreted as evidence of divine judgment. A person repeatedly struck by disaster might be seen not as unlucky, but as cursed. Odysseus returned to his ships with no wind to carry them. The men took up their oars. For 6 days, they rowed. Their arms burned. Their backs ached. The sea no longer carried them gently. Every mile had to be purchased through pain. On the 7th day, they reached a land called Telepolis, home of the Lastrygonians. The harbor appeared almost perfect. Tall cliffs rose on both sides, forming a narrow entrance. Inside, the water was calm. The surrounding rock protected the bay from wind and waves. 11 captains guided their ships into the enclosed harbor and tied them close together. Odysseus remained outside. He anchored his own ship near the entrance, beneath the cliff, and climbed to higher ground to observe the land. This act of caution saved his life. He saw no cultivated fields and no signs of ordinary work. Only a column of smoke rose in the distance. He sent 3 men inland to investigate. They followed a road and met a young woman drawing water from a spring. She was the daughter of Antiphates, king of the Lastrygonians. She directed them toward her father's house. The palace seemed enormous. Inside, the scouts found the queen. She was as large as a mountain and filled them with terror. She called for her husband. Antiphates entered, seized one of the Greeks, and prepared him as a meal. The other 2 fled. They ran toward the harbor while the king raised an alarm. From the surrounding heights, the Lastrygonians appeared. They were not ordinary people, but giants with immense strength. They gathered above the enclosed bay and began hurling rocks. The Greeks had entered a harbor that was really a trap. Massive stones crashed down upon the ships. Timber broke, masts splintered, men were crushed or thrown into the water. The narrow entrance that had seemed protective now prevented escape. The Laestrygonians speared the drowning sailors like fish and carried them away to be eaten. Odysseus watched the destruction from his ship outside the harbor. There was no time to rescue the others. He drew his sword, cut the anchor rope, and shouted for his crew to row. They pulled away into the open sea. Behind them, every other ship was destroyed. The fleet that had left Troy with 12 vessels was reduced to 1. Hundreds of men were gone. Only those who sailed with Odysseus remained. The loss changed the nature of the journey. Until this moment, Odysseus had still commanded a fleet. Even after storms and battles, the ships had moved together like fragments of the army that left Troy. Now, the last structure of that army disappeared. Odysseus was no longer a victorious commander leading many crews. He was the captain of a single damaged ship filled with frightened survivors. The Laestrygonian harbor offers another lesson about appearances. A sheltered place may conceal danger. Walls that protect can also imprison. Safety is not always found in the calmest water. The men rowed away in grief. They were alive, but survival had become a burden. Each escape carried the memory of those who had not escaped. Eventually, they reached another island. It was called Aeaea. The men pulled the ship onto the shore and remained there for 2 days and nights. They did not explore, they did not celebrate. They lay beside the sea, exhausted by labor and sorrow. On the 3rd day, Odysseus took his spear and sword and walked inland. From a rocky height, he saw smoke rising through the trees. Someone lived on the island. Odysseus returned to the shore. After eating, he divided the survivors into 2 groups. He commanded one. A trusted companion named Eurylochus commanded the other. They cast lots to decide which group would investigate the smoke. The lot fell to Eurylochus. He led 22 men through the forest. At the center of the island, they found a house built from polished stone. It stood in a clearing surrounded by wolves and lions. The men froze. Yet the animals did not attack. They approached gently, moving their tails and standing on their hind legs like dogs, greeting a familiar master. These creatures were not naturally tame. They had been altered by magic. From inside the house came the sound of a woman singing. Her voice drifted through the trees as she worked at a loom. She was Circe, a goddess and enchantress, daughter of the sun god Helios. The Greeks called out. Circe opened the door and invited them inside. All entered except Eurylochus. He remained hidden outside, suspicious of the easy welcome. Circe seated the men and prepared a meal. She mixed cheese, barley, honey, and wine. Into the food, she added a powerful drug. The men ate. Then Circe touched them with a wand. Their bodies changed. Their arms became legs. Their faces lengthened. Coarse hair covered their skin. Their voices became animal cries. She transformed them into pigs. Yet their human minds remained. This detail makes the punishment especially cruel. They understood what had happened. They remembered their names, their homes, and the shape of their former bodies. But they could no longer speak. Circe drove them into a pen and threw acorns before them. The scene reverses the hospitality Odysseus had hoped to find throughout his journey. Like Polyphemus, Circe offers food, but the meal does not nourish the guest. It destroys his human identity. The danger is different from the Cyclops. Polyphemus consumes bodies. Circe changes bodies until the human being becomes trapped inside an animal form. Eurylochus waited. When no one returned, he ran back to the shore. He told Odysseus that the men had vanished inside a strange house. He had heard no battle and seen no bodies. They had simply entered and disappeared. Odysseus took his sword and prepared to go alone. Eurylochus seized his knees and begged him not to leave. He believed that anyone who entered Circe's house would never return. He urged Odysseus to sail away with the men who remained. Odysseus refused. Again, He could have chosen survival over loyalty. But abandoning the transformed men would have meant accepting that companions could be left behind whenever rescue seemed difficult. Odysseus had failed to save the ships in the Laestrygonian harbor. Here, he still had a choice. He walked into the forest alone. On the road, a young man appeared. It was the god Hermes in disguise. Hermes warned Odysseus about Circe. He explained that she would offer him enchanted food and strike him with her wand. Then the god gave him a protective herb. Its root was black. Its flower was white as milk. The gods called it moly. Hermes told Odysseus to mix the herb with Circe's drink. Her poison would then have no power over him. He also gave Odysseus precise instructions. When Circe attempted to transform him, Odysseus must draw his sword and rush toward her, as though he intended to kill her. She would become afraid and offer peace. But before trusting her, he must force her to swear a sacred oath that she would not harm him. The advice reveals the partnership between human intelligence and divine assistance. Odysseus is clever, but cleverness alone is not always enough. He needs knowledge that only a god can provide. Yet Hermes does not rescue the companions himself. Odysseus must still enter the house, drink from the cup, face the enchantress, and act at the correct moment. He continued through the trees. The lions and wolves gathered around him without attacking. Circe opened the door. She welcomed him with a smile. Inside, she prepared the same mixture she had given the others. Odysseus placed the moly into the drink and swallowed. Circe raised her wand. She struck him and ordered him into the pig pen. Nothing happened. Odysseus remained human. He drew his sword and leapt toward her. For the first time, Circe was afraid. She fell to her knees and asked who he was. No ordinary man, she said, had ever resisted her magic. Then she recognized him. A prophecy had once warned her that Odysseus would come to her island on his return from Troy. Circe offered friendship and invited him to remain in her house. Odysseus remembered Hermes' warning. He demanded an oath. Circe swore by the gods that she would not weaken, betray, or destroy him. Only then did Odysseus lower his sword. Servants entered and prepared a bath. They brought warm water, clean clothing, food, and wine. But Odysseus did not eat. He sat in silence. Circe asked why he refused her hospitality. Odysseus answered that no honorable man could enjoy a feast while his companions remained imprisoned as animals. Circe took her wand and went to the pig pen. She touched the men again. Their animal bodies disappeared. They became human, younger and more beautiful than before. When they saw Odysseus, they gathered around him and wept. Even Circe felt pity. She told Odysseus to return to the shore and bring the rest of his crew to her house. The men could pull their ship onto land and hide their possessions in caves. Odysseus went back through the forest. When the survivors saw him, their relief was like that of calves seeing their mothers return. He told them that the missing men were alive and that Circe now offered food and shelter. Most followed him gladly. Eurylochus refused. He reminded them that curiosity had led Odysseus into the cave of Polyphemus. He accused his king of bringing death upon his companions. His words were painful because they were not entirely false. Odysseus had made mistakes. His pride had awakened Poseidon's anger. His decisions had placed men in danger. For a moment, Odysseus considered killing Eurylochus. The surviving crew restrained him. The dispute reveals how badly trust had been damaged. Odysseus blamed the men for opening the bag of winds. Eurylochus blamed Odysseus for taking unnecessary risks. Both sides carried reasons for resentment, yet they still needed one another. Eurylochus eventually followed. The entire crew entered Circe's house. There they ate, drank, bathed, and rested. They remained on Aea for 1 full year. The island became a place outside the ordinary movement of time. The men had food, their wounds healed, their clothing was clean, no enemy pursued them. After years of war and wandering, Comfort was almost irresistible. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Odysseus did not forget Ithaca completely, but he stopped moving toward it. Circe's danger was not only her magic. It was her ability to make delay feel harmless. Her island offered a softer version of the lotus. The men did not lose their memories. They simply allowed their longing to become quiet. At last, the companions approached Odysseus. They reminded him of home. They asked whether he still intended to return. Their words awakened him. Odysseus went to Circe and begged her to keep the promise she had made. It was time for him to leave. Circe did not refuse, but she told him that the road to Ithaca could not yet be followed. Before sailing home, Odysseus had to travel in the opposite direction. He must cross the river ocean and enter the land of the dead. There, among the shadows, he must speak with the blind prophet Tiresias. Only the dead could tell him how to return to the living. Odysseus listened in silence. He had survived monsters, storms, and enchantment. Now he was being asked to sail beyond the edge of the human world. That night, the men prepared to leave the comfort of Circe's halls. Ahead of them waited no welcoming harbor, no sunlight, no song of birds, only a shore covered in mist, a river surrounding the world, and the countless voices of those who would never return home. Morning came quietly over the island of Circe. The men gathered near the shore, preparing the black ship for a voyage none of them wished to make. They carried food, fresh water, and the animals Circe had instructed them to bring. There was no excitement among them now. No one spoke of treasure or foreign cities. They had been told that their next destination lay beyond the paths of ordinary sailors. They were going to the land of the dead. Before they departed, another loss occurred. Among the crew was a young man named Elpenor. He was not the strongest warrior or the wisest sailor. Homer tells us that he lacked both courage and good judgment. During the final night on Circe's island, he had climbed onto the roof of her palace to sleep in the cool air. When he woke before dawn, confused and still affected by wine, he forgot where he was. He stepped from the roof and fell. His neck broke, and his spirit descended into the world below. The others did not yet know what had happened. They were busy launching the ship, raising the sail, and following Circe's directions. Elpenor's body remained behind, unburied and unmourned. It is a small death beside the enormous losses of the voyage. Yet the Odyssey repeatedly pauses for such lives. Not every man who dies is a famous hero. Some are frightened, ordinary, careless, or unlucky. Their deaths do not become glorious songs, but they still create obligations among the living. Odysseus and his companions boarded the ship. A favorable wind rose behind them, sent by Circe. All day, the sail remained full. The island disappeared, and the sea stretched around them beneath a fading sky. At sunset, they reached the outer limits of ocean, the great river that the ancient Greeks imagined flowing around the edge of the world. There lay the land of the Cimmerians. It was a country covered in cloud and mist. The sun never seemed to shine upon it. No bright morning warmed its fields, and no evening light touched its shore. The people lived beneath a permanent darkness. The ship came to rest beside the gray water. Odysseus and his men stepped onto the silent land. Circe had given him exact instructions. He dug a trench in the earth. Into it, he poured milk mixed with honey, then wine, then water. He scattered barley over the offerings and prayed to the dead. He promised that, after returning to Ithaca, he would sacrifice a barren cow and burn precious goods in their honor. For Tiresias, the prophet he had come to meet, Odysseus promised a black ram. Then the men brought forward a ram and a black ewe. Odysseus cut their throats over the trench. The dark blood flowed into the earth. At once, the dead began to gather. They came from the darkness in great numbers. Brides who had died young, unmarried men, old people exhausted by years, warriors still marked by wounds, children who had known only a brief life. Their voices rose around Odysseus like the sound of frightened birds. These were not the shining spirits later imagined in peaceful heavens. The dead in Homer exist as shadows. They remember pieces of life, but they lack its warmth and strength. They cannot taste blood or speak clearly until they approach the offering. They are present, yet diminished. Their existence makes mortal life appear fragile, but also precious. Odysseus drew his sword. He stood over the trench and prevented the spirits from drinking until Tiresias arrived. Then, among the countless shades, he saw someone he recognized. It was Elpenor. Odysseus was shocked. When he had last seen the young man, Elpenor had been alive in Circe's palace. Odysseus asked how he had reached the underworld before the ship. Elpenor explained his foolish death. He begged Odysseus not to leave his body unburied. He asked him to return to Circe's island, burn the corpse with its armor, raise a mound beside the sea, and place his oar upon it. The request was simple. Elpenor did not ask for a palace or a statue. He asked for burial, remembrance, and the sign of the life he had lived as a sailor. In the Greek world, burial was more than a private farewell. It allowed the dead to enter their proper place and protected the living from the disorder created by an abandoned body. To deny burial was to deny a person's humanity. Odysseus promised to honor him. Then another spirit approached. It was his mother, Anticlea. Odysseus had not known that she was dead. When he left Ithaca for Troy, she had been alive. For years, while he fought and wandered, he had imagined her waiting at home. Now she stood before him as a pale shadow. He wanted to speak with her, but Tiresias had not yet arrived. Odysseus held her away from the blood. This is one of the most painful acts of restraint in the poem. He has crossed the world of darkness and found his own mother, yet he must deny her voice until his duty is completed. At last, Tiresias appeared. Even in death, the blind prophet carried a golden staff. The goddess Persephone had allowed him to preserve his understanding, while the other spirits drifted in confusion. Tiresias drank from the trench. Then he spoke. He told Odysseus that Poseidon still hated him for blinding Polyphemus. The journey home would remain difficult, yet return was possible. The prophet warned him about an island belonging to Helios, the sun god. Sacred cattle grazed there. If Odysseus and his men left the animals unharmed, they might still reach Ithaca. But if they killed the cattle, destruction would follow. The ship would be lost. Every companion would die. Odysseus would return late, alone, and in sorrow. Even then, his trials would not be finished. He would find arrogant men inside his palace, consuming his wealth and seeking marriage with Penelope. He would have to punish them. After restoring order in Ithaca, Odysseus must make one final journey. He must carry an oar inland until he reached people who knew nothing of the sea. They would mistake the oar for a farming tool. There, he must offer sacrifice to Poseidon and make peace with the god. Only then could his wandering truly end. Tiresias also foretold Odysseus's death. It would come gently, far from the sea, when he was old and surrounded by a prosperous people. This prophecy offers a strange kind of hope. Odysseus has spent years struggling against death, yet peace will come only when he accepts that he is mortal. He cannot escape the final boundary. He can only hope to reach it after a complete life. The prophet withdrew. Odysseus allowed his mother to drink. Her voice returned. He asked about Ithaca. He asked whether Penelope still waited for him, whether Telemachus still lived in the palace, and whether his father, Laertes, remained alive. Anticlea told him that Penelope had not abandoned him. She spent her days in grief and her nights in tears. Telemachus guarded the estate as well as he could. Laertes lived in the countryside, sleeping in humble conditions and mourning his absent son. Then Odysseus asked how his mother had died. He feared disease or violence. Her answer was quieter. She had died from longing. She said that her love for Odysseus and her sorrow over his absence had taken her life. The journey home suddenly carried another cost. Odysseus had thought of himself as the sufferer. He had endured storms, imprisonment, hunger, and the deaths of friends. But absence has two directions. The traveler suffers because he cannot return. Those at home suffer because they do not know whether to hope or mourn. Odysseus reached for his mother. His arms passed through her. He tried again. Again, he embraced only air. 3 times he attempted to hold her, and 3 times her shadow slipped away like a dream. He asked why she would not remain in his arms. Anticlea explained that this is the condition of death. When life leaves the body, the flesh and bones are consumed, and the spirit flies away. Odysseus could receive her words, but not her warmth. Memory could restore a voice. It could not restore a body. After Anticlea departed, other spirits approached. Odysseus saw women from ancient legends, queens and mothers whose stories connected the heroic age to the gods. Each carried a history of love, suffering, ambition, or divine interference. Then came the dead of Troy. Agamemnon approached. The commander of the Greek army had reached home after the war, but his return had ended in murder. His wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover Aegisthus had killed him in his own palace. Agamemnon described the betrayal bitterly. He warned Odysseus not to trust any woman completely. His anger had turned one act of treachery into a judgment upon all wives. Yet the Odyssey places Agamemnon's story beside Penelope's for a reason. Both men return from Troy. One comes home openly and is killed. The other will return in disguise and test the loyalty of his household. Clytemnestra betrays her husband. Penelope preserves her marriage through 20 years of uncertainty. The contrast reminds us that home is not automatically a place of safety. It is a place that must be known again. Odysseus cannot simply arrive at his door and assume that time has preserved everything exactly as he left it. Next, he saw Achilles. During the war, Achilles had been the greatest warrior among the Greeks. He had chosen a short life, filled with glory, rather than a long life in obscurity. His name would be remembered forever. Odysseus praised him. He said that Achilles had been honored like a god in life, and now ruled among the dead. Achilles rejected the comfort. He told Odysseus that he would rather serve as a poor laborer for another man than rule over all the lifeless shadows. The words challenged the heroic values that drove the war at Troy. Glory survives, the person does not. Achilles has achieved the fame promised to him, but from the underworld, fame feels like a thin reward. The smallest experience of life, even hardship beneath the sun, is worth more than kingship among the dead. This lesson stands at the heart of Odysseus's journey. His final goal is not greater glory, it is life. He wants to feel the earth of Ithaca beneath his feet. He wants to eat at his own table, speak with his son, care for his aging father, and lie beside Penelope. The ordinary world, which warriors once left in search of fame, has become the greatest treasure. Achilles asked about his son, Neoptolemus. Odysseus told him that the young man had fought bravely at Troy and survived. For a moment, the shadow of Achilles moved away with pride. Even among the dead, a father finds comfort in the life of his child. Odysseus also saw Ajax. During the war, Odysseus and Ajax had competed for the armor of Achilles. Odysseus had won. Ajax, humiliated, later died by his own hand. Odysseus tried to speak with him. He expressed regret and asked that their anger end. Ajax remained silent. He turned away into the darkness. Not every wound can be healed by explanation. Some resentments outlive both men who carry them. The underworld contains not only memory, but memory that has become permanent. Odysseus saw figures suffering for crimes against the gods. Tantalus stood in water that disappeared whenever he bent to drink. Fruit hung above him, but moved beyond reach whenever he raised his hand. His punishment gave the world the word tantalizing, the torment of something desired but never possessed. Sisyphus pushed a heavy stone up a hill. Each time the stone neared the top, it rolled back down. He began again. Their punishments had no completion. They were labor without homecoming, movement without arrival. This makes them dark reflections of Odysseus. He too is repeatedly driven backward. He reaches toward home only to see it disappear. Yet, unlike Sisyphus, Odysseus still possesses hope. His suffering has a possible destination. The dead continued to gather. Their number became overwhelming. Odysseus began to fear that Persephone might send the head of a terrible monster from the depths. He turned away from the trench and ordered his men back to the ship. They boarded quickly. The current carried them from the land of darkness, and soon the wind returned. Odysseus had entered the underworld seeking directions. He left carrying something heavier. He now knew that his mother was dead. He knew that Penelope lived in sorrow, that Laertes had withdrawn from the palace, and that danger awaited him in Ithaca. He had heard Achilles reject glory, and Agamemnon describe the treachery of home. He had seen that death does not erase memory, but traps it beyond the reach of touch. The voyage back to Circe's island was quiet. When they arrived, the men found Elpenor's body where it had fallen. They burned it with his armor. They raised a mound above the ashes and fixed his oar at the top. Only then was the forgotten sailor given his proper farewell. Circe came to meet them. She was amazed that Odysseus had entered the house of death and returned. She called him a man who had died twice, once in imagination and once in the journey itself. She brought food and wine. The men ate beside the sea, grateful for daylight. As night fell, Circe explained the dangers ahead. First came the Sirens, whose song drew sailors toward death. Then came a narrow passage between two terrors. On one side waited Scylla, a many-headed creature who seized men from passing ships. On the other waited Charybdis, a whirlpool capable of swallowing the sea itself. Beyond them lay the island of Helios. There, the sacred cattle grazed. Circe repeated the warning of Tiresias. They must not touch them. Odysseus listened carefully. The path home had been revealed, but knowledge did not remove danger. It only gave danger a name. Before sunrise, the companions returned to the ship. Circe sent a favorable wind behind them. The sail filled. The island slowly faded into the distance. Ahead, somewhere beyond the bright horizon, a song was waiting for Odysseus. It promised knowledge of everything that had happened at Troy and everything hidden in the world. To hear it, he would have to sail close enough to death to recognize its voice. The ship moved away from Circe's island under a steady wind. Behind Odysseus lay the house of the enchantress, the voices of the dead, and the warning of Tiresias. Ahead lay a series of dangers that could not be defeated by courage alone. Circe had described them carefully. First, the Sirens, then the narrow sea between Scylla and Charybdis, and beyond them, the island where the sacred cattle of Helios grazed beneath the sun. The companions sat at their oars as the island of Aea faded behind them. Some men watched the horizon, others stared silently at the deck. They had survived more than any crew should have survived. They had seen their friends eaten by monsters, crushed beneath stones, and transformed into animals. They had sailed into the country of the dead and returned to daylight. But survival had not made them fearless. It had made them tired. Odysseus told them what Circe had revealed. He did not describe every danger at once. A commander sometimes protects his men by limiting what they know. Too much fear can destroy discipline before danger even arrives. But he told them about the Sirens. The Sirens lived on an island surrounded by bones. Their weapon was not strength, it was song. Any sailor who heard them would turn his ship toward their shore. He would forget his companions, his destination, and the life waiting for him at home. He would hear only the promise hidden in their voices. The Sirens did not merely sing beautifully. They claimed to possess knowledge. They knew what had happened during the war at Troy. They knew the suffering of Greeks and Trojans. They knew the events of the past and the secrets of the world. For Odysseus, this made them almost impossible to resist. His greatest weakness was not simple pleasure. It was the desire to know. Odysseus wanted to see what others had never seen. He wanted to hear stories hidden from ordinary men. He wanted to understand the world, even when understanding placed him in danger. Circe had given him a way to survive. Odysseus softened wax in his hands and pressed it into the ears of every companion. They would row past the island without hearing the song. But Odysseus chose another path for himself. He ordered the men to tie him upright against the mast. The ropes were wrapped around his body and pulled tight. He told the crew that no matter what he said, they must not release him. If he begged, threatened, or commanded them to untie him, they must bind him even more tightly. The wax sealed their ears. The ropes held Odysseus in place. The ship continued forward. At first, there was only wind and water. Then the breeze disappeared. The sail became still. The sea flattened into a shining surface, and the ship drifted into an unnatural silence. The men lowered the sail and began rowing. Odysseus watched the distant island. Then he heard the song. The voices were gentle. They welcomed him by name. They called him Odysseus, glory of the Greeks, the man whose intelligence had destroyed Troy. They promised that he would leave them wiser than before. No sailor, they said, passed their shore without learning the truth. The song offered something more dangerous than pleasure. It offered recognition. For years, Odysseus had been reduced by suffering. He had become a shipwrecked wanderer, a grieving commander, and a man hated by the sea. The Sirens spoke to the identity he still desired. They remembered him as the hero of Troy. They knew his name, they knew his glory, and they promised to reveal the meaning of everything he had endured. Odysseus struggled against the ropes. He shouted at the crew to release him. But the men could not hear. They saw his face, his gestures, and the desperation in his body. Remembering his order, they pulled the ropes tighter. The ship moved onward. The Sirens continued singing. Odysseus listened until the voices grew faint. Then the island passed behind them, and the wind returned. Only when the sound had vanished completely did the companions remove the wax from their ears and untie him. Odysseus had heard the forbidden song and survived. Yet he survived only because he had prepared for his own weakness. This is one of the most important forms of intelligence in the Odyssey. Odysseus does not pretend that he is immune to temptation. He knows that desire can overpower judgment. Instead of trusting his future self, he creates limits in advance. He places his survival in the hands of companions who cannot be persuaded by his voice. Wisdom is not always the power to resist. Sometimes, wisdom is the decision to make surrender impossible. The ship continued toward the narrow passage. Soon, the men heard a terrible sound. Water thundered ahead. Smoke or mist rose from the sea. The companions stopped rowing in fear, and the oars slipped from their hands. Odysseus moved among them, speaking quietly. He reminded them of the cave of Polyphemus. They had escaped that prison through courage and thought. They could survive again. But he did not tell them about Scylla. Circe had warned him that Scylla could not be defeated. She lived in a high cave above the water. From her body extended 6 long necks, each ending in a mouth filled with rows of teeth. As ships passed beneath her cliff, each head seized one sailor. Across the channel waited Charybdis. 3 times each day, Charybdis swallowed the sea. 3 times, she released it again. Any ship caught above her whirlpool would disappear completely. Odysseus faced a choice between 2 horrors. If he sailed close to Charybdis, the entire ship might be destroyed. If he sailed close to Scylla, 6 men would die. Circe had told him to choose Scylla. It was better to lose a few than to lose everyone. This is not a heroic choice. There is no victory in it. Odysseus cannot save all his companions. He can only decide how many will be sacrificed. He put on his armor and carried 2 spears. Circe had warned him that weapons would not help, but he could not approach danger unarmed. Perhaps the gesture comforted him. Perhaps he could not accept that intelligence and courage had reached their limits. The ship entered the passage. On one side, Charybdis pulled the sea downward. The men stared in terror as the water vanished into a vast, dark mouth. The bottom of the ocean seemed exposed beneath them. Waves crashed against one another, and foam rose high into the air. Everyone watched the whirlpool. That was when Scylla attacked. 6 heads descended from the cliff. Each mouth seized a man from the deck. Odysseus saw them lifted into the air, kicking and reaching toward him. They called his name. Their hands stretched downward as Scylla carried them toward the cave. Odysseus could do nothing. He later remembered this as the most terrible sight of his entire journey. He had seen cities burn. He had watched men crushed beneath stones and eaten by the Cyclops. But here, the victims were alive, calling for him as they were carried away. Their final word was the name of the commander who could not save them. The ship passed beyond the cliff. 6 places on the deck were empty. The survivors continued rowing. There was no time to mourn. The sea ahead opened again, and in the distance appeared the island of Thrinacia. This was the island of Helios. Across its fields wandered the sacred cattle and sheep of the sun god. The animals did not reproduce, and they never died. Their number remained unchanged. Tiresias had warned Odysseus. Circe had warned him. If the cattle were harmed, the ship and crew would be destroyed. Odysseus wanted to sail past the island. But Eurylochus protested. The men were exhausted. They had rowed through terror. Night was approaching. To continue sailing in darkness would be dangerous. Eurylochus accused Odysseus of having a heart made of iron. Ordinary men, he said, needed sleep. The companions agreed. Odysseus gave in. He made them swear an oath that they would not touch the cattle. They had food aboard the ship. They could eat what Circe had provided. The men swore. They landed. At first, the weather remained calm. They ate their stored provisions and rested beside the shore. Then a storm arrived. The wind blew without interruption. Day after day, the ship remained trapped. The men could not leave. 1 month passed. Their food disappeared. They began fishing and hunting birds. They searched for roots and anything else that might keep them alive. Hunger weakened their bodies. It also weakened their promises. Odysseus prayed to the gods for guidance. Then, while he was alone, the gods placed him into a deep sleep. Eurylochus gathered the starving men. He told them that every death was hateful, but death by hunger was the worst. Better, he argued, to kill the finest cattle, offer part of the meat to the gods, and survive. If they returned to Ithaca, they would build a rich temple to Helios. If Helios became angry and destroyed them, at least they would die quickly at sea, rather than slowly beside untouched food. The argument was desperate. It was also persuasive. The men surrounded the cattle. They selected the strongest animals, killed them, and prepared a sacrifice. They had no barley, so they used oak leaves. They had no wine, so they poured water. The ritual looked like worship, but it was also a violation. They tried to transform disobedience into sacrifice. Odysseus woke and smelled roasting meat. He understood immediately. The goddess who guarded the cattle flew to Helios and reported what had happened. Helios demanded justice from Zeus. He threatened that unless the crew was punished, he would leave the sky and shine among the dead. Zeus promised to destroy the ship. Strange signs appeared on the island. The hides of the dead cattle began crawling. The meat on the spits made sounds like living animals. The men were terrified, but hunger was stronger. For 6 days, they ate the sacred cattle. On the 7th day, the storm ended. Odysseus ordered everyone aboard. They raised the sail and left the island. The coast disappeared behind them. Then the sky darkened. A cloud formed above the ship. Zeus hurled a thunderbolt. The mast broke and struck the helmsman, killing him. The ship spun across the waves. The hull shattered, and every man was thrown into the sea. The companions disappeared beneath the water. Not one survived. The prophecy of Tiresias had been fulfilled. Odysseus was alone. He tied pieces of the broken mast and keel together and climbed onto the wreckage. The wind carried him back toward the narrow passage. Ahead, Charybdis swallowed the sea. The current pulled him toward the whirlpool. Odysseus saw a fig tree growing from the cliff above the water. As the wreckage disappeared beneath him, he jumped and caught one of its branches. He hung above the churning sea. Below him, Charybdis swallowed the remains of the ship. Odysseus waited, his arms weakened. There was no place to rest. No companion could help him. He clung to the branch until Charybdis released the water again. When the broken timbers rose from the depths, Odysseus let go. He fell into the sea, climbed onto the wreckage, and paddled away with his hands. For 9 days, he drifted. He had no food, no sail, no crew. Every man who had left Troy with him was dead. On the 10th night, the sea carried him toward an island covered in trees. This island was Ogygia. There lived Calypso, a goddess whose name is connected with hiding and concealment. She found Odysseus near the shore. She brought him into her home, fed him, clothed him, and saved his life. After years of violence, he had reached a place of beauty. There were no monsters on Ogygia, no armies, no storms within its protected shores. There was only a goddess who desired him and an island from which he could not leave. The voyage of Odysseus had destroyed every ship and taken every companion. Now, the final temptation would be offered to him. He would be given safety, love, and freedom from death. But to accept them, he would have to abandon Ithaca forever. For 7 years, Odysseus lived on the island of Ogygia. It was a place of almost impossible beauty. A forest surrounded the cave of Calypso. Alder, poplar, and cypress trees rose above the island, filled with the wings of birds. Vines, heavy with grapes, climbed around the entrance. 4 springs flowed in different directions through soft meadows of parsley and violets. Even the gods might have paused there in wonder. Calypso lived at the center of this hidden world. She was immortal, powerful, and untouched by age. When she found Odysseus washed ashore, nearly dead, she gave him food, clothing, and shelter. She restored his strength. Then she refused to let him leave. The island became a beautiful prison. Calypso offered Odysseus what few mortals had ever been offered. If he remained with her, she would make him immortal. He would never grow old. He would never feel his body weaken. He would never descend into the darkness he had seen in the land of the dead. He would live forever beside a goddess. Yet each day, Odysseus walked to the shore. He sat upon the rocks and looked across the empty sea. He wept. At night, he returned to Calypso's cave because he had nowhere else to go. But during the day, his heart remained fixed upon Ithaca. The choice before him reveals the deepest meaning of his homecoming. Odysseus does not reject Calypso because Penelope is more beautiful. He openly admits that an immortal goddess cannot be compared with a mortal woman. Penelope will age. She will change. One day, she will die. That is precisely why returning to her matters. Human love is shaped by time. A marriage becomes meaningful not because it escapes change, but because 2 people endure change together. Odysseus does not desire an eternal life detached from loss. He wants his own life, limited and imperfect, among the people who know his history. Calypso offers him existence without death. Ithaca offers him belonging. For 7 years, he chooses belonging in his heart, even while his body remains trapped. Far away, the gods continue to watch. Poseidon still hates Odysseus, but the other immortals begin to pity him. Athena, who has favored him since the war, speaks before Zeus. She reminds the gods that Odysseus once honored them with sacrifices. Now he sits forgotten on a distant island while disorder spreads through his home. Zeus agrees that the time has come. Hermes is sent to Ogygia. He flies across the sea in golden sandals and enters Calypso's cave. The goddess receives him with food and drink, following the law of hospitality, even among immortals. Then Hermes delivers the command. Odysseus must be released. Calypso is angry. She accuses the male gods of hypocrisy. Gods may love mortal women without punishment, she says, but goddesses are condemned when they choose mortal men. She had saved Odysseus when the sea cast him onto her island. Now she is ordered to surrender him. Her anger is understandable. Yet affection becomes possession when the beloved person is denied the freedom to leave. Calypso cannot provide a ship or crew, but she promises to help Odysseus build a raft. She will give him tools, food, water, clothing, and a favorable wind. She finds him in his usual place beside the sea. Odysseus is staring toward a horizon that has never answered him. Calypso tells him that he may go. He does not believe her. After 7 years of captivity, freedom itself seems suspicious. Odysseus fears that she is planning another trap. He asks her to swear that she will not harm him. Calypso swears. That evening, she asks why he still longs for Penelope when immortality is within his reach. Odysseus answers carefully. He acknowledges Calypso's beauty. He knows Penelope is mortal and cannot rival a goddess. Still, he says, he longs every day to return home. This is not a rejection of beauty. It is a declaration that beauty alone cannot replace a life. The next morning, Odysseus begins working. For 4 days, he cuts trees, shapes timber, drills holes, and joins the pieces together. He builds a broad raft with a raised deck and a mast. Calypso brings cloth for a sail. On the 5th day, she bathes him, clothes him, and places provisions aboard. Odysseus leaves Ogygia. For 17 days, he sails beneath the stars. He keeps the Great Bear to his left, following the directions Calypso has given him. For the first time in years, he controls his own movement. Then Poseidon returns from a distant land. The sea god sees Odysseus. His anger rises. Poseidon gathers the clouds and strikes the ocean with his trident. Winds rush together from every direction. Waves rise around the raft, and the sky disappears. Odysseus believes he is about to die. He remembers the warriors who fell at Troy and envies them. They died before witnesses. Their bodies were honored. Songs preserved their names. To drown alone would be different. The sea would swallow him without a grave. A wave crashes over the raft and throws him into the water. He struggles back and clings to the broken timber. Then a sea goddess named Ino appears. Once mortal herself, she understands human fear. She gives Odysseus a magical veil and tells him to wrap it around his body. He must abandon the raft and swim. Odysseus hesitates. He has survived by distrusting appearances. A stranger emerging from the sea may be another danger. He remains on the raft until another wave shatters it completely. Only then does he obey. He ties the veil around himself and enters the water. For 2 days and nights, Odysseus swims. Athena calms the winds, but Poseidon leaves the sea rough enough to torment him. Odysseus cannot see a safe place to land. The first shore he approaches is lined with sharp rocks. Waves strike the cliffs with enough force to break his bones. He pulls away. At last, he discovers the mouth of a river. Odysseus prays to the river god, asking for mercy. The current becomes gentle. He reaches the bank. His body is swollen from salt water. His skin is torn. He is exhausted beyond movement. He removes Ino's veil and throws it back into the sea as instructed. Then he crawls into a nearby forest. The night is cold. Odysseus gathers dry leaves and covers himself beneath 2 bushes. Athena places him into a deep sleep. The king of Ithaca lies naked beneath leaves, unknown and alone. This is the lowest point of his identity. He has lost his army, ships, armor, treasure, clothing, and even the appearance of a civilized man. Nothing remains except the mind within him and the desire to continue living. The land where he has arrived is called Scheria. It belongs to the Phaeacians, a people famous for their ships and their understanding of the sea. They live close to the gods, protected from the wars and disorder of other nations. Their king is Alcinous. Their queen is Arete. Their daughter is Nausicaa. While Odysseus sleeps beneath the leaves, Athena visits Nausicaa in a dream. Disguised as one of her friends, the goddess reminds the princess that she will soon need clean clothing for marriage. She should take the household laundry to the river. In the morning, Nausicaa asks her father for a wagon. She is too shy to mention marriage directly. She says that her brothers need clean clothing for public gatherings. Alcinous understands more than she says. He provides the wagon. Nausicaa and her attendants travel to the river. They wash the garments, spread them beneath the sun, eat, and begin playing with a ball. One throw goes into the water. The girls cry out. The sound wakes Odysseus. He rises beneath the bushes and listens. He wonders whether he has reached a land of civilized people or violent strangers. Breaking a leafy branch from a tree to cover himself, he steps into the open. The attendants see a wild, salt-covered man emerging from the forest. They run. Nausicaa remains. Athena gives her courage. Odysseus faces another test of intelligence. He needs help, but he must not terrify the young woman before him. He considers approaching her knees as a traditional gesture of supplication. Then he realizes that touching her might frighten her. He remains at a respectful distance. He speaks gently. He compares Nausicaa to a young palm tree he once saw beside the altar of Apollo. He praises her dignity and asks for clothing and directions to the city. He does not reveal his name. Odysseus has learned the value of concealment. Nausicaa answers with compassion. She explains that the Phaeacians do not reject strangers. She calls her attendants back and orders them to give the man food, oil, and clothing. Odysseus bathes alone so that the young women will not see his nakedness. Athena makes him appear taller and more handsome. When he returns, Nausicaa looks at him with wonder. She tells him how to reach the palace. To avoid gossip, he must not walk directly beside her wagon. He should follow at a distance, enter the city later, and approach Queen Arete first. The queen holds great influence in the household. Odysseus follows her instructions. Athena hides him in a mist as he enters the city. He walks past harbors filled with ships and through streets built by people who understand navigation better than any nation he has seen. At the palace, the mist disappears. Odysseus enters the great hall. He passes King Alcinous and throws his arms around the knees of Queen Arete. He asks for passage home. Then he sits in the ashes beside the hearth. For a moment, the hall is silent. An elderly counselor reminds the king that it is wrong to leave a stranger sitting in dust. Alcinous raises Odysseus from the floor, places him in a seat, and orders food and wine. The laws of Xenia are restored. The Phaeacians do not ask his name before feeding him. They honor the stranger first. Alcinous promises that they will help him return home, wherever his home may be. Odysseus weeps with relief. The next day, the king gathers the Phaeacian leaders. Games are held in honor of the guest. Young men compete in running, wrestling, jumping, boxing, and throwing the discus. At first, Odysseus refuses to participate. He is tired. A young Phaeacian insults him, suggesting that he looks more like a merchant than an athlete. The old pride awakens. Odysseus lifts a heavy discus and throws it farther than every other competitor. He declares that he will compete with anyone except his host. The moment reminds us that the warrior still lives within him. Homecoming does not erase his pride. It teaches him when to reveal it and when to control it. At the feast, a blind singer named Demodocus performs. He sings about the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles during the war. Odysseus hides his face and weeps. Later, the singer tells the story of the wooden horse and the fall of Troy. Again, Odysseus cries. The Phaeacians celebrate the song because Troy is distant to them. To Odysseus, it is not a legend. It is memory. He hears his suffering transformed into entertainment. Alcinous notices the tears. He stops the performance and asks the stranger who he truly is. At last, Odysseus speaks his name. He tells them that he is Odysseus, son of Laertes, known throughout the world for his cunning. Then he tells the story of his wanderings. The Cicones, the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Aeolus and the Bag of Winds, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the Land of the Dead, the Sirens. Scylla and Charybdis, the cattle of Helios, Calypso. The Phaeacians listened through the night. These are the adventures we have followed, but within the structure of the Odyssey, they are memories narrated by Odysseus himself. He becomes the storyteller of his own suffering. This raises a quiet question. How much of Odysseus can be separated from the stories he tells? His intelligence lives not only in plans, but in narration. He arranges events, he explains choices, he preserves the dead by naming them. Through storytelling, he transforms years of chaos into a path that can be understood. Alcinous is moved. He orders the Phaeacians to prepare their finest ship. Gifts of bronze, gold, clothing, and treasure are placed aboard. That evening, Odysseus eats among generous hosts for the final time. When night comes, he boards the ship. The Phaeacian sailors spread a soft covering for him at the stern. Odysseus lies down. As the ship leaves Scheria, he falls into the deepest sleep he has known since the war began. The Phaeacian vessel moves faster than any bird. It crosses the sea without effort, guided by sailors who never lose their way. Odysseus does not see Ithaca approach. He does not watch for its hills. He does not hold the rudder. After 20 years of struggle, he reaches home while sleeping. Before dawn, the Phaeacians carry him from the ship and place him gently upon the shore. They arrange his treasure beneath an olive tree. Then they sail away. Odysseus remains asleep on the soil of his own kingdom. The long voyage across the sea is over. But the homecoming is not complete. His palace is occupied, his wife is surrounded, his son is in danger. And when Odysseus opens his eyes, Athena will hide Ithaca beneath a mist, so that even the man who has dreamed of this island for 20 years will not recognize it. Odysseus awoke upon the shore of Ithaca without knowing where he was. For 20 years, he had imagined this island. He had remembered its rocky hills while standing beneath the walls of Troy. He had seen its coastline in dreams while trapped in the cave of Calypso. He had spoken its name to kings, monsters, goddesses, and ghosts. Now Ithaca was beneath his body. Yet Athena had covered the land in mist. The familiar harbor appeared strange. The trees seemed unknown. The paths did not awaken recognition. Odysseus rose in confusion and looked around for the Phaeacian ship. It was gone. His first thought was that he had been deceived. Perhaps the Phaeacians had abandoned him in a foreign country. Perhaps they had stolen his treasure. After so many betrayals, suspicion had become instinct. He began counting the gifts they had left beside him. Nothing was missing. Then a young shepherd approached. It was Athena in disguise. Odysseus asked what land he had reached. The goddess told him that this was Ithaca. He did not fall to the ground in joy. He did not immediately reveal his name. Instead, Odysseus invented a story. He claimed to be a fugitive from Crete who had killed a man and crossed the sea in secret. Athena smiled. Even on the soil of home, Odysseus remained himself. No other mortal, she said, was so determined to hide behind words. Then she changed her appearance and stood before him as the goddess he knew. The mist disappeared. Odysseus recognized the harbor, the trees, and the cave of the nymphs. He touched the earth and thanked the gods. But Athena warned him that his trials were not finished. More than 100 suitors had taken control of his palace. They slaughtered his animals, drank his wine, and demanded that Penelope choose one of them as her husband. They had begun planning the murder of Telemachus. Odysseus listened. The warrior within him wanted immediate revenge. Athena advised patience. If he entered the palace openly, the suitors would overwhelm him. He had no army. The men who once sailed beneath his command were dead. To reclaim his home, he would have to become invisible again. Athena touched him with her wand. His skin wrinkled, his hair vanished, his clothing became torn and dirty, his eyes lost their brightness, and his body appeared thin with age. The king became a beggar. The transformation carried a deeper purpose than concealment. Odysseus had spent his life building a name. Now he had to discover how people behaved toward a man who appeared to have no status, wealth, or protection. A stranger at the door reveals the character of a household. The laws of Xenia would be tested one final time. Athena told Odysseus to seek shelter with Eumaeus, the swineherd. Eumaeus had remained loyal during his master's absence. While Odysseus gathered information, Athena would travel to Sparta and guide Telemachus home. Odysseus hid the Phaeacian treasure inside a cave. Then he walked into the hills. The path led through forests and rough country until he reached the enclosure where Eumaeus cared for the royal pigs. Dogs rushed toward the stranger. Odysseus dropped his staff and sat upon the ground, avoiding any movement that might provoke them. Eumaeus ran from his hut and drove the animals away. He apologized. The swineherd did not know that the dirty old man before him was his king. He saw only a vulnerable traveler, and that was enough. He invited Odysseus inside. Eumaeus spread branches and animal skins for his guest. He prepared food, poured wine, and offered the stranger the best portion he could provide. He honored Xenia without expecting reward. Then he spoke sorrowfully about Odysseus. Eumaeus believed that his master was probably dead, yet his loyalty had not disappeared. He condemned the suitors for consuming another man's property and ignoring the gods. Odysseus listened to his servant mourn him. The experience was strange. He had heard singers celebrate his intelligence. He had heard enemies curse his name. Now he heard the quiet grief of a man who remembered not the hero of Troy, but the master who had treated him kindly. Odysseus wanted to reveal himself. He resisted. Instead, he offered another false identity. He said that he came from Crete and had suffered through war, shipwreck, and wandering. He claimed to have heard reliable news that Odysseus was alive and approaching Ithaca. Eumaeus did not believe him. Many travelers had brought false stories to Penelope, hoping to receive clothing or food. Hope had been used against the household too many times. Still, the swineherd treated the stranger generously. Hospitality did not depend upon believing every word of a guest. That night, cold rain fell across the hills. Odysseus tested Eumaeus with a story from the war. He described a freezing night outside Troy when he had lacked a cloak. In the story, another soldier had used clever words to help him obtain one. Eumaeus understood the hint. He gave the beggar a warm cloak and prepared a bed near the fire. Odysseus observed everything. Loyalty had survived in this humble hut more completely than in the royal palace. While Odysseus slept, Telemachus was returning to Ithaca. The young prince had spent much of the Odyssey searching for news of his father. Guided by Athena, he had visited Nestor at Pylos and Menelaus at Sparta. He had listened to stories about the men who returned from Troy and the men who never came home. His search did not bring Odysseus back. It changed Telemachus. When he left Ithaca, he was uncertain and powerless. The suitors mocked him inside his own house. By traveling among kings and speaking with survivors of the war, he began to understand the responsibilities of adulthood. He learned that a son cannot live forever beneath the absence of his father. He must eventually stand in his own name. The suitors had sent men to ambush Telemachus on his return, but Athena warned him, and he avoided them. He landed secretly and traveled to the hut of Eumaeus. When Telemachus appeared, the swineherd embraced him like a father receiving a lost son. Odysseus watched from inside. He saw the infant he had left 20 years earlier, now grown into a tall young man. Telemachus did not recognize him. He saw only a beggar sitting near the fire. Eumaeus welcomed the prince, gave him food, and reported that Penelope remained surrounded by the suitors. Then Telemachus sent the swineherd to the palace to tell his mother that he had returned safely. Odysseus and Telemachus were left alone. Athena appeared where only Odysseus could see her. She touched him again. His rags became clean clothing. His body grew strong. His face became younger, and his hair darkened. Telemachus stepped backward in fear. He believed the stranger must be a god. Odysseus told him the truth. He was not a god. He was his father, Telemachus did not believe him. The claim was too large. For most of his life, Odysseus had existed as a story. Some said he was dead. Others promised that he would return. The young man had learned to distrust both grief and hope. Odysseus explained that Athena had changed his appearance. Then father and son embraced. They wept together. Their cries were compared to birds whose young had been taken from the nest. This reunion is not easy or immediate. Telemachus cannot simply recover the childhood he never had. Odysseus cannot return to the infant he remembered. They must meet as two adult men, separated by time and joined by blood. When their tears ended, Odysseus described the plan. Telemachus must return to the palace and behave as though nothing had changed. Odysseus would enter later in the form of a beggar. They would endure insults without reacting. Telemachus would remove the weapons from the great hall, leaving only a few for themselves. When the proper moment came, they would strike. Odysseus warned his son that courage would require silence. Telemachus agreed. The next day, father and son traveled separately toward the palace. Odysseus entered Ithaca as a stranger. On the road, he met Melanthius, a goat herd who had betrayed the royal household and supported the suitors. Melanthius mocked the beggar, cursed him, and kicked him. Odysseus felt anger rise. He could have killed the man easily. He continued walking. Restraint was becoming his greatest weapon. Near the palace gates lay an old dog. His name was Argos. Once, Argos had been a strong hunting animal trained by Odysseus himself. Now he lay neglected upon a pile of dirt, covered with fleas. When Odysseus approached, Argos lifted his head. His ears moved. His tail made a weak motion against the ground. No one else recognized the king. The dog did. Odysseus turned his face away to hide his tears. He could not touch Argos. He could not speak his name. Any sign of recognition might expose the disguise. After seeing his master return, Argos died. He had waited 20 years. The scene is brief, but it carries the sorrow of Ithaca more powerfully than a battle. The neglected dog reflects the neglected kingdom. Without its rightful ruler, the household has decayed. Yet Argos also represents memory that survives beneath ruin. The body grows weak. Recognition remains. Odysseus entered his own hall. The suitors sat at tables covered with meat and wine. Servants moved among them. Music filled the room. Odysseus stood at the doorway, holding out his hand for food. Some suitors gave him bread, others laughed. Antinous, the most violent among them, demanded to know why the stranger had been allowed inside. When Odysseus answered calmly, Antinous lifted a wooden stool and threw it. The stool struck Odysseus in the shoulder. He did not fall. He did not draw a weapon. He warned that the gods punish cruelty toward strangers. The suitors laughed again. Penelope heard what had happened. She condemned Antinous and asked to speak with the beggar. Perhaps this traveler had heard news of Odysseus. But Odysseus delayed the meeting until evening, when fewer people would be watching. Before that meeting, another beggar entered the palace. His name was Arneus, though everyone called him Iris. He carried messages for the suitors and depended upon their favor. Iris became angry when he saw another beggar near the tables. He feared losing his place. The suitors encouraged the two old men to fight. Odysseus tried to avoid the contest, but Iris continued threatening him. At last, Odysseus tightened his rags around his waist. The suitors saw the strength hidden beneath his aged appearance. With a single controlled blow, Odysseus broke Iris's jaw. He could have killed him. He chose not to. The hall became quiet for a moment. The beggar was no longer amusing. There was something dangerous beneath the rags, though no one yet understood what it was. Later, Penelope entered the hall. Athena had given her extraordinary beauty, but grief remained in her voice. She stood before the suitors and reminded them that proper courtship required gifts. A man seeking marriage should bring wealth to the household, not consume it. Ashamed and eager to impress her, the suitors offered clothing, jewelry, and gold. Penelope's intelligence had not weakened during the years of waiting. She had already delayed marriage through the famous trick of the shroud. She told the suitors that she must finish weaving a burial cloth for Laertes, the father of Odysseus. Each day she worked at the loom. Each night she secretly undid what she had woven. For 3 years she held them back. A disloyal servant eventually revealed the deception. Now Penelope needed other forms of delay. Like Odysseus, she survived through patience, disguise, and control of language. Husband and wife had been separated for 20 years, but they had developed the same weapons. When night came, the hall grew quieter. Penelope summoned the beggar. Odysseus sat across from his wife. She did not recognize him. The moment required almost unbearable self-control. Odysseus had dreamed of this reunion across every sea. Now Penelope was close enough to touch, yet he had to speak as another man. She asked his name and homeland. Odysseus told another Cretan story. He claimed that Odysseus had once visited his family before sailing to Troy. To make the lie convincing, he described the clothing Odysseus had worn. Penelope began to weep. She recognized every detail. Odysseus felt his own grief, but his eyes remained steady. Homer compares them to horn or iron. He comforted her and promised that Odysseus was near. Penelope listened, but years of false reports had taught her caution. She described her suffering. By day, she managed the household. At night, grief returned. She dreamed of her husband, but waking took him away again. Then she told the stranger about a dream. 20 geese fed in the palace yard. An eagle descended and killed them. The eagle then spoke, declaring that the geese were the suitors and that the eagle was Odysseus. The disguised king interpreted the dream plainly. Odysseus would return and destroy the men occupying his home. Penelope remained uncertain. Dreams, she said, pass through 2 gates. Dreams that come through ivory deceive. Dreams that come through horn reveal the truth. She had survived too long to trust hope easily. Penelope ordered an old servant named Euryclea to wash the stranger's feet. Euryclea had cared for Odysseus when he was a child. As she touched his leg, she felt an old scar above the knee. Odysseus had received it during a boar hunt when he was young. The servant recognized him instantly. The basin fell from her hands. Water spilled across the floor. Euryclea looked toward Penelope, ready to reveal everything. Odysseus seized her gently by the throat and warned her to remain silent. The old woman promised. Penelope, distracted by Athena, had not noticed. Once again, Odysseus was known and unknown at the same time. The dog had recognized him. His nurse had recognized him. His son knew him. His wife did not. Yet Penelope announced that the long waiting would soon end. The next day, she would hold a contest. She would bring out the great bow of Odysseus. The suitors must attempt to string it and shoot an arrow through a line of 12 axe heads. The man who succeeded would become her husband. Odysseus listened. This bow belonged to his earlier life. Few men possessed the strength and skill to use it. The contest would gather every enemy into one room. It would place a weapon in the hands of the king. Penelope rose and left for her chamber. Odysseus remained beside the dying fire. Around him stood the walls he had built, the tables he had owned, and the men who believed his absence had become permanent. Tomorrow, the stranger would take the bow. Tomorrow, patience would end. And the house that had forgotten its master would hear the sound of his name returning. Morning came to Ithaca beneath a quiet sky. Inside the palace, servants prepared the hall. Tables were arranged, fires were lit. Animals were brought for sacrifice and food. The suitors gathered as they had gathered every day, confident that the household belonged to them. They did not know that this would be their final feast. Odysseus remained in the form of an old beggar. He watched the doors. He watched the servants. He watched the faces of the men who had consumed his wealth, insulted his son, pressured his wife, and plotted murder beneath his roof. For years, Odysseus had survived by acting quickly. Now he survived by waiting. Penelope entered the storeroom where the weapons of the household were kept. There, wrapped carefully and preserved through the years, lay the great bow of Odysseus. It was not an ordinary weapon. The bow had once been given to Odysseus by a man named Ithaca. It belonged to a time before Troy, before wandering, before the sea filled his life with loss. Odysseus had left it behind when he sailed to war, perhaps because it carried the memory of friendship rather than battle. Penelope lifted the bow. As she held it, she began to weep. The weapon was more than wood and string. It was a piece of her husband's presence. It had waited in silence while his name became uncertain. She carried it into the hall. Behind her came servants holding a chest of iron axe heads. Penelope placed the bow before the suitors and announced the contest. The man who could string the bow and shoot an arrow cleanly through the openings of 12 axe heads would become her husband. The suitors looked at one another. At last, the long delay seemed finished. Telemachus stood and arranged the axes in a straight line. Then, before allowing the suitors to try, he lifted the bow himself. He attempted to string it. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, he nearly succeeded. Odysseus gave him a silent signal. Telemachus stopped. The son must not reveal too much before the father is ready. One by one, the suitors took the bow. They warmed it beside the fire. They rubbed it with animal fat. They strained until their hands hurt and their faces reddened. None could string it. The weapon rejected them. They had occupied the house, eaten the livestock, commanded the servants, and demanded the king's wife. But they could not master the object that represented the man they wished to replace. Outside, Odysseus quietly left the hall. He met Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, and Philoetius, a cattle herder who had also remained faithful. Odysseus asked them how they would respond if their master returned. Both men declared that they would fight beside him. Then Odysseus revealed the scar upon his leg. He told them who he was. The men embraced him and wept. Odysseus instructed them carefully. They must lock the outer doors. They must prevent anyone from escaping. They must bring the bow to him when he asked. Then they returned to the hall separately. Inside, the suitors continued failing. At last, Odysseus spoke. He asked for permission to try the bow. The hall erupted in laughter. Antinous accused him of becoming foolish from wine. Another suitor warned that a beggar had no right to touch the weapon of a king. Penelope defended the stranger. She reminded them that the contest had been announced publicly. If the beggar could string the bow, she did not have to marry him. She could reward him with clothing and protection. Telemachus then took control. He told his mother that the bow belonged to him as heir of the household. He asked her to return to her chamber. Penelope obeyed, though she did not fully understand what was about to happen. Athena guided her into sleep. Eumaeus carried the bow across the hall. The suitors shouted at him. He continued. He placed the weapon in Odysseus's hands. Odysseus turned it slowly. He examined the wood for damage. He tested the horn and the polished surfaces. Then, with the ease of a musician tightening a string, he bent the bow and secured it. The string sang beneath his fingers. A sound moved through the hall. The suitors became quiet. Odysseus selected an arrow. Without rising from his seat, he aimed. The arrow passed through all 12 axe heads. Outside, thunder rolled across the clear sky. Zeus had given a sign. Odysseus stood. He removed the rags from his shoulders. Telemachus stepped beside him. The old beggar disappeared, and the king of Ithaca stood before the men in his house. Odysseus placed another arrow upon the string. He aimed at Antinous. Antinous was lifting a cup of wine when the arrow struck him in the throat. The cup fell from his hand. Blood covered the table. At first, the suitors believed it was an accident. They shouted at the stranger and threatened him with death. Odysseus answered in his own name. He told them that they had believed he would never return. They had consumed his property, abused his servants, pursued his wife, and ignored the laws of gods and men. Now their final hour had come. Fear moved through the hall. The suitors searched for weapons, but Telemachus had removed them earlier. Eurymachus attempted to speak for the group. He blamed Antinous for everything. Antinous, he said, had led the others. He had planned to kill Telemachus and seize the kingdom. Now that Antinous was dead, the remaining men would repay everything they had taken. Odysseus refused. The crime was not a debt that could be measured in cattle, wine, or gold. The suitors had violated the deepest order of the household. They had entered as guests and behaved as masters. They had turned hospitality into occupation. Eurymachus drew a sword and charged. Odysseus shot him through the chest. The battle began. Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philoetius stood beside Odysseus. 4 men faced the suitors. At first, Odysseus used the bow. Arrow after arrow crossed the hall. When the arrows began to run out, Telemachus brought spears, shields, and helmets from the storeroom. But in his haste, he left the door open. Melanthius, the disloyal goat herd, climbed into the room and carried weapons to the suitors. For a moment, the balance shifted. Odysseus realized that someone was helping his enemies. Eumaeus and Philoetius discovered Melanthius and captured him. They bound him high inside the storeroom, then returned to the battle. Athena appeared in the form of Mentor, an old friend of Odysseus. At first, she did not destroy the suitors herself. She wanted to test the courage of Odysseus and Telemachus. The suitors threw their spears. Athena guided them away. The weapons struck walls and door frames. Odysseus and his companions answered. The suitors fell one by one. The hall that had been filled with music became a place of shouting, dust, and blood. Some tried to fight. Some begged. Some searched for a door that would open. None escaped. Among them was a singer named Phemius, who had performed for the suitors under pressure. He fell to his knees and begged for mercy. Telemachus spoke in his defense. Odysseus spared him. A herald named Medon had also remained loyal to Telemachus. He was spared as well. The punishment was not meant to destroy every person in the palace. It was meant to distinguish loyalty from betrayal. When the last suitor fell, the hall became silent. Odysseus stood among the overturned tables. The battle was finished, but home had not yet been restored. The old nurse Euryclea was called. When she saw Odysseus standing alive and victorious, she began to cry out in joy. Odysseus stopped her. There was no honor in celebrating death, even the death of guilty men. He asked her to identify the servants who had remained loyal and those who had supported the suitors. The disloyal servants were punished. The hall was cleaned. The floors were washed. The tables were restored. Sulfur was burned to purify the rooms. The palace had to be made into a home again. Violence could remove disorder. It could not, by itself, create peace. Euryclea ran to Penelope's chamber. She told her that Odysseus had returned. Penelope did not believe her. For 20 years, she had been forced to live between hope and deception. Travelers had brought false news. Dreams had promised impossible reunions. Each new claim had carried the risk of another wound. She went downstairs slowly. At the entrance to the hall, she stopped. Odysseus sat near a pillar. His clothing was still marked by battle. Penelope looked at him. He looked at her. Neither moved. Telemachus became angry. He accused his mother of having a heart of stone. His father had returned after 20 years, yet she did not embrace him. Penelope answered quietly. If this man was truly Odysseus, she and her husband shared signs that no other person knew. Athena transformed Odysseus once more. She washed away the dirt and blood. She made him appear taller, stronger, and younger. His hair curled around his head. He stood before Penelope with the appearance of the man she had remembered. Still, she waited. Odysseus became frustrated. He asked Euryclea to prepare a bed for him outside the marriage chamber. Penelope replied with a test. She told the servant to move their marriage bed from the room. Odysseus reacted immediately. No one could move that bed. Long ago, when he built the palace, a living olive tree had grown inside the place where the bedroom would stand. Odysseus had shaped the room around it. He cut the trunk above the roots. He carved the wood into a bedpost. Around that living foundation, he built the bed. To move it, someone would have to cut the tree from the earth. Odysseus described every detail. Then Penelope knew. No stranger could have known the secret. She ran to him. They embraced. Penelope wept against his shoulder. Odysseus wept with her. Homer compares their relief to shipwrecked sailors reaching land after the sea has nearly killed them. The comparison is perfect. Penelope has never left Ithaca, yet she too has survived a voyage. Her sea was time. Her storms were uncertainty, pressure, loneliness, and grief. Odysseus crossed oceans to return to her. Penelope remained in one place and endured until he arrived. Their marriage bed is one of the deepest symbols in the Odyssey. It is made from a living olive tree. Its roots remain beneath the house. It cannot be moved without destroying the structure that holds it. The bed represents a marriage grounded not in appearance, youth, or convenience, but in shared knowledge and endurance. Calypso offered Odysseus immortality. The Sirens offered knowledge. Circe offered comfort. The Lotus Eaters offered forgetfulness. Penelope offers recognition. She knows who he is because she knows what they built together. That night, Odysseus and Penelope spoke for hours. Athena lengthened the darkness so that dawn would not arrive too soon. Odysseus told his wife about the journey. He told her about the Cyclops, Circe, the dead, the Sirens, Scylla, Calypso, and the sea. Penelope told him about the suitors, the weaving, the threats, and the years of waiting. They could not recover the lost time. They could only share the stories of how they had survived it. At dawn, Odysseus prepared to leave the palace once more. He still had to see his father. Laertes lived outside the city, working among the fields. Grief had aged him. He wore rough clothing and slept in humble conditions. Odysseus found him in an orchard. At first, the son did not reveal himself. Habit remained strong. He told another false story and claimed to have known Odysseus long ago. Laertes began to weep. Odysseus could no longer continue the deception. He embraced his father and revealed the scar upon his leg. Still uncertain, Laertes asked for another sign. Odysseus named the trees in the orchard. When he was a child, Laertes had given them to him one by one. 13 pear trees, 10 apple trees, 40 fig trees, rows of vines. The memory proved his identity. The old man understood that his son had returned. 3 generations now stood together. Laertes, Odysseus, Telemachus. But danger remained. The families of the dead suitors gathered in anger. They wanted revenge. Led by Eupeithes, the father of Antinous, they marched against Odysseus. Another cycle of violence was about to begin. Odysseus, Telemachus, Laertes, and their loyal companions armed themselves. The two sides met. Laertes threw a spear and killed Eupeithes. Odysseus prepared to continue the battle. Then Athena intervened. She commanded everyone to stop. Zeus sent a thunderbolt. The people of Ithaca understood that the conflict must end. Athena established peace between Odysseus and the families of the suitors. Only then was the homecoming complete. Odysseus had returned to Ithaca earlier, but arrival was not enough. He had to reclaim his identity. He had to reunite with his son. He had to test the loyalty of his servants. He had to be recognized by his wife. He had to reconnect with his father. He had to restore order between the household and the wider community. The journey ends not with conquest, but with peace. This is why the Odyssey is more than an adventure story. Odysseus defeats monsters, but the greatest challenge is resisting the forces that might make him forget why he is traveling. The Lotus asks him to abandon memory. The Cyclops awakens his pride. Aeolus tests trust. Circe offers comfortable delay. The dead reveal the cost of glory. The Sirens tempt him with perfect knowledge. Calypso offers escape from mortality. The suitors force him to choose patience over immediate revenge. At every stage, Odysseus is tested not only as a hero, but as a human being. He wins because he remains imperfect. He is proud, suspicious, curious, and sometimes reckless. His choices bring suffering upon others. His intelligence saves him, but it also creates danger. Yet he continues. He suffers without allowing suffering to erase his destination. And when he is offered immortality, he chooses an aging wife. When he is offered endless comfort, he chooses a rocky island. When he is offered freedom from grief, he chooses memory. The ancient Greeks called this return nostos. But nostos does not mean simply reaching a geographical place. It means becoming capable of belonging there again. Odysseus begins as the man who helped destroy Troy. He ends as the man who chooses to restore a home. He begins with a wooden horse built for deception and war. He ends beside a bed built around a living tree. One structure breaks open a city. The other anchors a marriage. One creates fame, the other preserves life. And so the story closes not upon the sea, but within the boundaries of home. The waves still move beyond Ithaca. The gods still watch from above. The names of the dead remain in memory. But inside the palace, the rightful family has returned to its place. After 20 years, Odysseus is no longer sailing toward home. He is there. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this ancient journey. If this story helped you relax, reflect, or drift a little closer to sleep, please support Ancient Stories to Sleep by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing forgotten worlds, timeless myths, and quiet history back to life. You can also share this story with someone who may need a peaceful voice tonight. Until our next journey, rest well, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world fade gently into your dreams.